Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. It is so nice to be here. We have our daughter visiting from Virginia, so we have a little bit later start today. It's so nice to have her back here with us for a short time. And today, Stephen is going to talk to you about a subject very dear to his heart. This is a history lesson, and I know that some of you absolutely love digging deep into the history like that. So Stephen is going to come up here and he's going to talk to you about the Fourth Evangelist and Eusebius, and I don't know that it would be a conflict, but a tension that has been happening, and it is deeper than I can introduce here, so I'm just going to have him come up here, and he's going to talk to you about the Fourth Evangelist and Eusebius. So thank you, honey, for preparing and teaching us this big lesson today.
Well, good morning, Legacy Bible Church. It is good to be with you. And as you know from past teachings, I like to stay focused and steeped in the Bible, in the Scriptures. And here in the most recent teachings, I was in the Gospel of John, and I'm going to pick up again here in the Gospel of John because I'm going to be, probably mainly because I'm going to be translating in John here for the next month or two while I'm in between classes. And not coincidentally, the seminar that I'll be in the coming semester is going to be on the Gospel of John. So I'm really looking forward to that. And it just means I'm probably going to be in the Gospel of John a lot through the winter months and even into the spring months. And I am definitely looking forward to that. But as you know, from time to time, I will talk about the history of the church in really a pure historical perspective. I don't necessarily exegete the Scriptures as much as I'm going back based on the early Christian literature and some secular literature. And I'm talking about post-biblical, after the writings of the New Testament. We have Christian literature that is the earliest is known as the Apostolic Fathers. They are the church leaders for which we have writings after the apostles. We call them the Apostolic Fathers because they were the first generation writing after the apostles, and the last apostle being the Apostle John, the Fourth Evangelist, who wrote late in the first century. And so today is going to be a discussion very much about from that time, from the Fourth Evangelist, John, all the way through the second century, and a couple of letters that were written to the Pope at, they didn't call him the Pope then, but he was just the bishop of the church at Rome. But the Roman Catholic tradition has called them popes all the way back to their first one in the lineage being Peter. They call them the Pope, but they did not, in those early centuries, they did not call their the leaders of the local churches popes. They called them bishops, if anything. And often they wouldn't even use the term bishops. They would use the term presbyters or elders, which is what John, as you know, called himself. John did not call himself the bishop at Ephesus. He called himself John the Elder, John the Presbyter. And so that's often what the leadership of the early churches called themselves. And so today I'm going to do a kind of, Stephen Hawkins wrote a book that I love. I read it many, many years ago called A Brief Moment in Time. And so I'm sort of going to give you today a brief period in the history of the church, the early history of the church. And it's going to be a fairly fast walk because we have limited time here. But in this brief time, I want to give you, if I may, I want to give you kind of a snapshot, maybe a short social video, social media video. You know how they're short, they capture a lot, they're not meant to be real intense and detailed. I'm going to have a lot of detail, but in the context of what might normally be written in a scholarly writing on the subject, which I have just completed one here. It's about a 60-page report. I turned it in as my final research assignment in a seminar on early Christian history, and not coincidentally, I didn't really plan it this way. I didn't really intend it this way, but it sort of fell out that this research assignment is a good introduction, good summary of the entire dissertation that I've been working on for several years now, and will probably be several more years in the working on the early history of the church. It begins, of course, with Jesus on the cross, and in the earliest days of the church, a controversy broke out over how do we observe, how do we practice the Christian faith. And there was a very brief period of time in the earliest years of the church where it was pretty unanimous around what would come to be known. Irenaeus called it at the end of the century, at the end of the 2nd century, he called it the ancient tradition of the apostles. It was that original kernel of faith practice that existed unanimously in the church in its earliest period of time, its earliest years. But very early on in the church, due to pressure, religious pressure from the Jews at Jerusalem, very early on in the church, there began to emerge out of that kernel of pure Christian faith practice that existed in the first years. There began to emerge out of that what you might call a Judaized form of Christianity. And Paul in Galatians makes reference to that, beginning to sense that emergence as early as AD 36, when he made his first post-resurrection visit, post-conversion visit to Jerusalem in AD 36. He is talking about sensing this in James, the brother of the Lord. And he's just alluding to that something is just not quite the same between James and the other apostles. And then by the time he makes his second post-conversion visit to Jerusalem in AD 47, again, he's still writing in Galatians, the beginning of Galatians. Paul's kind of giving a short history, his history of the church. There are already the false brethren at Jerusalem that are significantly corrupting the gospel. They are Judaizing the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so that's why Paul would refer right at the beginning of Galatians, he would refer to the other euangelion, the other gospel, and he would refer to the gospel of Christ Jesus. Two different gospels, a duality of Christian traditions that existed there already. Paul is writing in the earliest years of the church, which is beginning to have crystallized after the initial persecution, where the Apostle James, not James the brother of the Lord, but the Apostle James was martyred at Jerusalem in AD 43, and James the brother of the Lord became the leader of the church at Jerusalem, because out of that martyrdom of the Apostle James, the apostles scattered, left a leadership void. James, the brother of the Lord, filled that void at Jerusalem, became the leader of the church at Jerusalem. And you see this Judaized form of Christianity coming out of that leadership transition and out of that persecution where James was martyred, and Peter was going to be next, but he had the miraculous escape and he skated out of town, got out of Jerusalem, left that void. That's the leadership transition. That's the beginning of the crystallization of this other euangelion that Paul writes about in Galatians. And of course, he goes on to write that certain men from after his first missionary journey in Galatia, he's back at Antioch, and some men come from James, he writes in Galatians to chapter 2, verses, I believe, 11 and 12. Certain men from James, those from the circumcision, came to Antioch with their now formally crystallized, Judaized Christianity that they're teaching. And Luke preserves in, that same scene that Paul writes about in Galatians, Luke preserves in Acts, when in Acts 15, 1 and 2, he says that these men from Judea came down to Antioch and Luke writes, were teaching that unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. These are Jewish Christians now with a counter mission. Paul had just had his mission to Galatia. They are now launching a counter mission out of Jerusalem to come against Paul's teaching ministry. And they're teaching that if you want to be saved, got to be circumcised according to the custom of Moses. And of course, that's not just the physical removal of foreskin. When you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses, it infers the entire law of Moses. They're saying if you want to be saved, you have to become a proselytized Jew. You have to walk in fully in the law of Moses. That was what was being taught in the early church. That's the tradition that became seated at Rome very early on. The Christians that were at Rome did not operate independently of the synagogue at Rome. They were a sect within the synagogue at Rome. That's how Christianity developed and evolved at Rome as part of the synagogue. And there was a significant synagogue presence in Rome. They probably had maybe 50,000 Jews in Rome at that time. So there was a significant Jewish community, a significant synagogue presence in Rome in those early years. It was very influential. The Jewish religion was legalized in the Roman Empire. So they were very influential, very powerful, and the earliest Christians at Rome were part of the synagogue at Rome. And they would have been very steeped in this Judaized form of Christianity. That would be the form of Christianity that emerged and developed and evolved at Rome. And you see this also in Acts chapter 28, when Paul goes to Rome and the brethren come down to meet him on the road. And of course, they have their called confrontation. They actually gave Paul a hearing. Paul talked about the full gospel, and they didn't accept it. In fact, they told Paul, these are brethren, which means that they are Christians. They came down to meet him, and one of the things they said to Paul, you can read this in Acts 28, is that we've heard about your teaching. We don't know you. We don't know what happened in Jerusalem with you, but we've heard about your teaching, and they called it a heresy, heresis. We've heard about your heresis, that it's not well spoken of everywhere. It's spoken poorly of, they said, everywhere. And so this is in AD 59, AD 60, when Paul first arrives at Rome, or on his way to Rome. And not coincidentally, this is about 3 years after he wrote Romans, right? And he sent Romans to Rome with who? With Phoebe, the deaconess from Centuria, which is a town right near Corinth. And so 3 years after the book of Romans, the letter to the Romans arrived in Rome, these Christian brethren are coming down to meet Paul on the road, saying that we don't know you and we don't know who you are, but we've heard about your teaching that is spoken poorly of everywhere. There's no reference made to the letter that they received from Paul called Romans. So my assumption is that these Judaized Christians at Rome, when Phoebe arrived, gave the letter of Romans, probably explained Romans to them, and it found the nearest waste paper basket, because no mention of it is made by the brethren that come down to meet Paul 3 years after he wrote Romans, as he is arriving in Rome. It's a non-issue. So is Phoebe, by the way. You never hear from Phoebe in Paul's 7 prison letters. He references many, many different brethren that are helping him, assisting him, some that are opposing him, and many of them being women, but he doesn't ever mention Phoebe again. Phoebe is not mentioned in his prison letter, so you wonder what happened to Phoebe. Did she even make it? I guess you could ask, did she even make it to Rome with the letter to the Romans? I think we can assume that she did. And so that's the history up to that point in time, AD 60. We have two different traditions in the early church. You have the full gospel that is being taught by Paul. He calls it the Evangelion of Christ, the gospel of Christ. And you have what Paul called the other Evangelion, the heteros Evangelion, the Judaized Christianity that is still clinging to Moses. And of course, Paul, again in Galatians chapter 5, said that if you're trying to keep the customs of Moses, if you're keeping the circumcision, if you're trying to be a Christian and walk in obedience to the law of Moses, he said, you are far away from Christ. Far away from Christ. The message is you can do one or the other. You can keep Moses, you can be obedient to Moses, or you can be obedient to Jesus Christ, but you can't do both. You can't strive after the law as your source of salvation and righteousness and strive after Jesus Christ. They are incompatible. And for reasons that I've taught in the past, but are too much for the context of the history that I want to do today. So that brings us up through Paul, the two traditions that are now steeped in the church, the early traditions that are competing with one another, the full gospel and the partial gospel. The full gospel, keeping obedience to Jesus Christ, and the partial gospel, keeping obedience to Moses. That's AD 60. That's in the earliest years of the church. And this partial gospel is steeped at Rome. Okay, then you have AD 70, actually 66 to 70. You have the Jewish-Roman War at the end, AD 70. Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, and major catastrophic defeat to the Jews, both with respect to the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, the death of about 1 million Jews at Jerusalem, taking captive of about 100,000 Jewish slaves and taken back to Rome. So the prestige of the Jews is being significantly impaired through that war. And not least in the context of the early Christian church, up to those years, the Christian church everywhere was largely led by Jewish Christians. The Jews in the Christian faith were the leaders of the church, almost without exception everywhere. Jews were leading the church. Well, after the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 70 and the destruction of the temple, that changed. The leadership of the church began to transition to Gentile leadership, and which would include also at Rome. So you have this Gentile leadership at Rome beginning to evolve and to take over this, what was a synagogue-based church prior to AD 70, was now a church separated from the synagogue, from the Jewish synagogue, and being led by Gentiles. But they brought with them that Judaized Christianity that they separated from the synagogue and began to evolve and develop at Rome, was basically a progeny, a descendant of the other Evangelion that they prospered and evolved at Rome. So let's move to the end of the first century. The John the Fourth Evangelist is finishing out his long life and his ministry at Ephesus in Near Asia, which is where Paul spent 3 years establishing the church. And of course, Paul left Timothy in charge of the church. We know that from the book of Acts and from Paul's letters. And so Timothy led the church, we're sure, for a number of years. We don't see anything else about that in the Christian literature. But we do know that the John, the beloved disciple, the disciple who laid his head on the breast of Jesus in the upper room at the Lord's Supper on the day of his passion, we know that this John, whom we also call the Fourth Evangelist, wrote the Gospel of John, and he wrote his 3 epistles from Ephesus late in his life. This will be near the end of the 1st century. So this is, say, 30-ish years after Paul. Paul died in AD 62 at Rome, and now in the late 80s, maybe even into the early 90s, call it 30 years later, a full generation later, John, the Fourth Evangelist, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the disciple who laid his head on the breast of Jesus, is writing a 4th gospel. And writing in those days is not like, me writing a research report today. I have a computer, we have this inexpensive paper, and I can type, and it comes out with beautiful, perfect print on a page. And it's very inexpensive to write and to publish and disseminate today, especially with email and whatnot. It wasn't like that in the ancient days. In the 1st century, you're writing on animal skins called parchment. That's very expensive. It's extremely expensive to manufacture animal skins into parchment for writing. And by the way, Ephesus, where John the Elder was, that's one of the things that they were known for. That was one of the sources of their economy, was the making of parchment. And they supplied parchment to all over the Roman Empire. So parchment was part of the culture there at Ephesus, the manufacture of parchment, where John was writing the 4th gospel. But it's a very expensive affair, very laborious to sit down and write out in Greek and then make copies through scribes. Human beings had to just by hand make copies. So the whole process was very slow, very laborious, and very expensive. It wasn't a simple thing to sit down and say, well, I'm going to write a 40, 50 page on parchment document that's going to be disseminated in many copies to many locations. That's a huge undertaking. And so John is an 80-year-old man by then, ostensibly. I think we can assume that he's in his 80s, and decides he's going to write a gospel. Well, why? Well, it's doubtful that it's because all of a sudden, as an 80-year-old man, he said, wow, I'm about to die. I don't have very many years left. I better record what I know, or it's going to go to the grave with me. If that were the case, he would have probably done it as a younger man. More likely, there was a compelling reason that had emerged its ugly head that caused John to say, I need to write down what I know. Because if I don't, this thing that is emerging is going to continue to grow and prosper and continue to corrupt the gospel. I believe that's why John wrote the 4th gospel. There's evidence, textual evidence, and you can compare Mark to John and see that there's so much, you could lay Mark and John next to each other, and it's almost like John is filling in the gaps on Mark. You can do it sequentially and see that the Gospel of John largely is filling in the gaps that were left in the Gospel of Mark. And you put them together, and it kind of presents then the full chronology and history of the Gospel, minus some. There are things in Matthew and Luke that would not be in the combined Mark and John, but largely John kind of fills in the gaps that were in Mark. And it's a pretty amazing correlation between those two. So that's one of the structural aspects to the Gospel of John. But when you look and read John, you find out something very significant is going on in the discourse in the Gospel of John that contrasts with, is very different than the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Whereas the synoptic Gospels refer to the Lord's passion, the suffering, they refer to the meal that they had in the upper room as the Passover, the Pascha, means Passover. all three of the synoptic gospels, which were out of a tradition that evolved very early in the church, call that meal in the upper room the Passover. And John doesn't do that. John reserves the word, and by the way, the synoptic gospels never refer to the Jewish Passover day with the word Passover. They always call it Sabbath. So the synoptics have a very distinctly different vernacular that's used in the Gospel of John. Whereas the synoptics refer to the meal in the upper room as the Passover, the Gospel of John refers to the meal in the upper room as the supper meal. That's all he calls it, the supper meal. And John, the fourth evangelist, writing late in the first century, will only use the word Passover as referring to the Jewish Passover day, which is the day after the Passion. It's the day after the Lord's Supper and the crucifixion that we have the Passover day. So why this difference? What is going on here between the synoptics and then this difference that John is bringing into the vernacular where they use the word Passover entirely different? And I think that you have to look into the second century and see what happened throughout the second century to understand what's going on there at the end of the first century that John, the fourth evangelist, is addressing, his reason for writing. And the primary controversy in the church throughout the second century became known as the Paschal controversy, the Passover controversy. The controversy was ostensibly over, and this is very simplistic and it's often viewed this way. It's wrong, I'll tell you up front, but it's often viewed this way. It's often thought that the Passover controversy was just about what day are you going to observe Easter week? What day of the year are we going to reserve as the holy day that we set aside to observe the historical fact and reality of Jesus having died on the cross and having been raised from the grave? And the two traditions that existed throughout the second century that became known as the Passover controversy. The Catholic Orthodox, at that time Proto-Orthodox, early Orthodoxy, and by Orthodoxy I'm talking about the tradition that evolved at Rome. They call themselves Orthodox, which means correct teaching. It doesn't mean they were correct teaching, it just means that's what they called themselves. So proto means early or first. Proto-Orthodoxy, evolving very early at Rome, celebrated, observed the Passion Week in its annual holy day on Sunday. Every year they had a Sunday, the first Sunday after the vernal equinox, which is the first day of spring. The first Sunday after the first full moon that followed the vernal equinox. That Sunday every year, the Proto-Orthodox tradition would observe as a holy day. That, by the way, is the tradition that carried out throughout history. It's the same day that you all know, we all know as Easter Day in our modern Christian context. It came out of that early Paschal controversy. So they celebrated on Sunday, the first Sunday after the full moon that follows the first day of spring, the vernal equinox. The other tradition, which was in accord with that earliest apostolic tradition, celebrated, observed would be a better word for it, observed their annual holy day, not on the Sunday following the first full moon after the vernal equinox, but on the actual Jewish day of the calendar on which Jesus was crucified, which would be known as 14 Nisan, the month of Nisan. That's the Jewish name of the month. They have the month of Nisan. That's the month that Passover always falls on. It's the month that follows after the vernal equinox. The month of Nisan, and Passover was always on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, because the first day of a month is a new moon. It's a dark moon. It's when a moon is starting a brand new cycle. It's dark. You can't see it. That's the first day of Nisan. And so the full moon of Nisan would be on the 15th, 14 days later. On the 15th of Nisan is the day of the full moon. And so Passover, the Jewish Passover day, is on 15 Nisan every year, according to the Jewish calendar. And so the other tradition, the ancient apostolic tradition, observed its annual, if you want to call it Easter. I don't like using the term Easter with it, because Easter is a term that came out of the Roman Catholic Orthodox tradition. This is just simply the day they called 14 Nisan was their annual holy day. That's the day on the Jewish calendar that Jesus had his last meal in the upper room with his disciples and was crucified on the cross. The Jews called that their day of preparation. It's the day they would slaughter the sheep at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then they would bring in Passover that evening. The Jewish day always started in the evening with sunset. And on that particular day, Nisan 15, there was a full moon rising over the horizon. And so this is the day 14 Nisan, the Jewish day of the month of Nisan, that Jesus had his upper room meal and was crucified on the cross. That's the annual holy day of the ancient tradition of the apostles that they would observe, that went by the Jewish calendar, Nisan 14. And this became known as the Quartodeciman controversy. Quartodeciman is the Latin word for 14. And so the Paschal controversy, because through the lens of the Catholic Orthodox Church at Rome, through that lens, the controversy had to do with these weird Christians that are still holding to the Jewish calendar. And this is all steeped in this controversy that's rearing its ugly head at the end of the first century, that is causing John the Fourth Evangelist to write a fourth gospel. It's one of the primary reasons driving his writing of a fourth gospel, is that this tradition that would ultimately come to full fruition as Catholic Orthodoxy was in its developmental stage. We call it proto-Orthodoxy. Its developmental stage in those early years. And John the Fourth Evangelist, late in his life from Ephesus, was seeing this manifesting at Rome and beginning to extend its tentacles out from Rome into other regions of the Roman Empire, to begin to promulgate, if you will, to begin to spread this other evangelion, this progeny out of that Judaized Christianity that first developed and got seeded at Rome, and continued to prosper and evolve at Rome after that transition in AD 70 to where Gentiles began to lead the church outside of the synagogue. They still had the Judaized Christianity that they were evolving. And so John from Ephesus, seeing this evolution begin continuing to grow, gaining influence, wrote his fourth gospel, and significantly to come against the misinterpretations of the synoptic gospels. The synoptic gospels were being misinterpreted because they called the upper room meal the Passover. The synoptic gospels were being misinterpreted as inferring that Passover meal occurred on Nisan 15. Because why else would they be calling it, the synoptic authors, why else would they be calling it the Passover meal, except that it was eaten on the Jewish Passover day, Nisan 15, which is not right. The upper room meal that the synoptic authors were calling the Passover meal was eaten on the day of preparation, Nisan 14, not 15. So because of this misinterpretation that was fueling this emerging tradition at Rome, where they didn't observe the cross and crucifixion so much as they wanted to observe and celebrate the resurrection. It was over that misinterpretation that John wrote and would not use the word Passover relative to the meal in the upper room. He called it the supper meal to clarify that. And he used the word Passover relative only to the Jewish Passover day, which was the day after the supper meal in the upper room and the day after the crucifixion on the cross. Again, recognizing the start of the day in the Jewish calendar as about 6 o'clock in the evening. They didn't start their new days in the morning the way that we have in Western culture. To keep all of these things in mind, to understand this early emergence, evolution of the controversy, John writing, why is he using different vernacular? What's his purpose? And he's confronting this tradition that's growing at Rome that is misinterpreting the synoptic gospels. John is writing the fourth gospel to bring, not to correct the synoptic gospels. They were true and correct, but they were being misinterpreted. And so to correct the misinterpretation, he wrote the fourth gospel using vernacular that would be different than the vernacular of the synoptic gospels in order to clarify what the synoptic gospel authors were really meaning so that they wouldn't be misinterpreted. This is what's going on at the end of the 2nd century. This is one of the main reasons why John wrote why John wrote a fourth gospel late in his life, something that's not easy to do, something that's very complicated, very complex, very expensive, but he takes it on in his last years to confront this emerging Paschal controversy that is starting to become a big problem for what I call the 14 Nisan apostolic tradition. End of the 1st century. We can fast forward all the way to the end of the 2nd century now, a full century later. There's much that could be said in that span between the end of the 1st century when John wrote the first gospel, because this Paschal controversy is beginning to be a problem. Much can be written all through the 2nd century, and I have in my dissertation. But for the sake of brevity here today, I'm fast forwarding. I'm leaping all the way to the end of the 2nd century, where we have 2 letters recorded by church fathers at the end of the 2nd century who are writing to I'm going to call him the Pope, because I think that resonates with a lot of modern listeners, writing to the Pope at Rome, Pope Victor, Bishop Victor at Rome. He's a brand new leader at Rome. The previous Pope or Bishop has just died. He's brand new. He's trying to make a name for himself. And he takes a drastic, unprecedented action here, right? A whole century after John the Fourth Evangelist wrote his fourth gospel, in order to put to bed this controversy. Well, it didn't put it to bed. A century later, it's still raging. And Pope Victor at Rome, in his new episcopacy as the leader of the church at Rome, takes the unprecedented drastic action of excommunicating all the churches of Asia, right? Asia, as in Asia Minor, where Ephesus, for instance, is Western modern day Turkey on the Aegean Sea. So we have Smyrna, Sardis, Troas, Constantinople, Ephesus, Laodicea, Colossae, Hierapolis. All of those cities that you've probably heard of are in this region of Near Asia. This is the stronghold. This is where Paul evangelized, right? That's where Paul planted some of his first churches in Near Asia. And this is where John, the fourth evangelist, finished his life, and many, many years ministered from out of Ephesus in Near Asia. So they have a very strong, they held tenaciously to the 14 Nisan ancient apostolic tradition. And so as this Paschal controversy continues to grow and continues to rage throughout the Roman Empire, mostly being propagated by the church at Rome, this is that part of that through the 2nd century that I just don't have time to get into today, but much of that controversy and persecution emanating from the church at Rome, who surreptitiously was using Roman secular power as its strong arm, but they were the instigators of it. Here at the end of the 2nd century, Bishop Victor at Rome takes the unprecedented action to excommunicate from the church all of the churches of Asia, because they wouldn't let go of their 14 Nisan tradition. They wouldn't conform to the Easter tradition of Rome, which is what Rome was demanding. Rome was demanding that of all the churches throughout the empire. And all the churches throughout the empire gave into it, conceded, and accepted the Roman tradition, Eastern tradition, all except the churches of Asia. And so in response to their obstinance, and they were just incalcitrant, just embedded and clinging tenaciously to their 14 Nisan tradition, the ancient tradition of the apostles, Victor of Rome, the Pope at Rome, took the unprecedented, drastic, unilateral, meaning acting on their own from Rome, not an ecclesial council where all the churches were against Asia. No, Victor, on behalf of the presbyters at Rome, acting unilaterally, just as the church at Rome, ostensibly feeling like they had authority over all the churches of the Roman Empire, excommunicated all the churches at Rome. They disfellowshipped them. They said, you are no longer going to be recognized by us as a legitimate part of the Church of God, or the Church of Christ, the church, whatever you want to call it. There are various biblical words for it. Eusebius referred to it as Church of God. It's referring to legitimate, organized, recognized churches that you would keep fellowship with. Victor said, no longer. You churches in Asia are removed from fellowship with all of the other churches, with us. And that brought a fairly swift reaction. But let's do two things. I want to talk about the reaction, but I also want to talk about really what prompted that action from Victor. He called for all of the regional sees, all the regional major centers of Christianity around the empire. A see is the center of authority for the regional governance of the church. So, for instance, in Northern Africa, you had, in Western Africa, you had Carthage was the see. In Eastern Egyptian Africa, you had Alexandria. In Palestine, you had Jerusalem and Caesarea and Antioch. In the Eastern Mediterranean were the major sees, the major governance centers for the church. In Asia, you had Ephesus. In the Balkan Peninsula, Greece and Macedonia, you had Corinth. And then, of course, in the Italian Peninsula, you had Rome. In France, in southern France, or the region that we know as Gaul, or during the Roman days was Gaul, you had Irenaeus was the leader of the major see in southern France. So Pope Victor had all of these major centers call together councils of their bishops, local regional synods, in order to affirm. His direction was that call together all the bishops under your jurisdiction all over the empire and affirm the Roman Catholic Orthodox tradition of celebrating the annual holy day on Sunday of the following the first full moon after the vernal equinox. get all the bishops together all over the empire and put this controversy to bed once and for all. And so they all did. They all issued letters. They all affirmed the Roman tradition, except the churches and the bishops in Asia, being led by the bishop at, not coincidentally, Ephesus. The bishop, his name was Polycrates. He was the 8th bishop in succession from Paul, and Paul planting the churches. He was now a little over 150 years later. He was the 8th bishop at Ephesus. Polycrates led the council of the Asian bishops and wrote the letter to Victor at Rome that said, not no, but HE double toothpicks no, we're not going to hold to or convert to the Roman Holy Day tradition. We are going to hold tightly to and no other than the 14 Nisan tradition that the ancient tradition of the apostles first had, that came to us by succession through the apostles. And of course, he mentions specifically John, the fourth evangelist, in this letter to Victor, that this tradition that we cling to, that we hold to, his inference in his letter, is what John, the fourth evangelist, was writing about at the end of the first century. That's what we're going to hold to. That was his counter. That was his letter to Victor. And that letter from Victor is recorded by the 4th century church historian Eusebius, a great historian. We should all be very thankful and grateful that he did what he did, because much of what we know about the early church in its first centuries comes from the writings of Eusebius. Well, he preserved these excerpts of these 2 letters, the one from Polycrates, which said to Pope Victor, not no, but heck no, we're staying with the 14 Nisan tradition, we're not changing. And he finished his letter by basically pointing at Victor and say, we're not afraid of your terrorist activities. He was essentially saying to him that you can terrorize us, which is what had been happening through the 2nd century. You can terrorize us, but we're not going to be, these are his words, we're not going to be intimidated. We are holding to the ancient tradition from the apostles that came to us from the apostles, and including, and he mentions specifically, the Apostle John. This is what prompted the action from Pope Victor in Rome to excommunicate all the churches in Asia. This is about circa AD 190, okay, the end of the 2nd century. That Victor says, okay, you're going to dig your heels in, you Asian bishops, then I'm excommunicating you from the church. You are no longer, we're no longer going to fellowship with you. We are no longer going to recognize you as part of the church. And this unilateral action from Pope Victor brought a response from other bishops who didn't like what Pope Victor had done. They thought that was going to be very dangerous, very, very damaging to the church to do this. And so one of the primary bishop that objected to what Pope Victor had done was Irenaeus, who was the bishop of the church at Lyon in Gaul, in modern day southern France. Bishop, let me tell you a little bit about him. Bishop Irenaeus was not a native of the region of Gaul, southern France. He was a native of, guess where? Asia. Irenaeus was born and raised in near Asia, the same region as these churches, and he was born and raised and born and raised in the region of Asia, and learned about the faith, converted to the faith, sitting at the feet of Polycarp. Polycarp was the last of the Apostolic Fathers. Remember, I mentioned the Apostolic Fathers were those church leaders who wrote, whom we have writings from after the apostles, the very first generation. Well, the very last of the Apostolic Fathers, the very last church leader in this first generation after the apostles was Polycarp of Smyrna in near Asia. And he was martyred for the faith in about AD 156. Very gruesome death. He was burned alive at the stake in a stadium at Smyrna because he would not deny the faith. He would not make sacrifice and confess to the what was known as the imperial religion. He would not make sacrifice to the emperor of the Roman Empire. And he was burned alive at the stake in about AD 56. This is who Irenaeus sat at the feet of. This is who Irenaeus learned about the faith from. And it's likely on a missional journey to take the 14 Nisan Christian faith tradition on a mission to a new land that he was part of a missional community that ended up settling in southern France, which is where now at the end of the 2nd century, during this raging controversy between Polycrates and the churches of Asia and the Pope at Rome, excommunicating them, Irenaeus emerges as the champion of the 14 Nisan churches. And he writes a letter to Pope Victor in defense of Polycrates and the churches of Asia. And this letter to Pope Victor was very successful in putting down that action, and it was basically rescinded. It was never really executed. And that letter at the time of Eusebius said that letter was still a source of harmony and peace for the churches as a whole in this Paschal controversy. But that's what happened at the end of the 2nd century. And what happened in between this act of the Pope at Rome to excommunicate the 14 Nisan churches at Asia and the century earlier, the Gospel of John, which was really the first apostolic effort to really engage with this emerging controversy, a full 100 years between those two events. You have the martyrdom of Ignatius, who was the bishop at Antioch, was taken from Antioch to Rome and was thrown in front of the wild beasts in the Colosseum at Rome, AD 113. In AD 138, you have the martyrdom of the Pope at Rome. His name was Telesphorus. He's the only bishop at Rome to be martyred in his first 200 years, if you want to exclude Paul and Peter. He was the only bishop at Rome to be martyred in 200 years, was Telesphorus in AD 138. And the reason that he ostensibly was martyred was because he was sympathetic to the 14 Nisan churches. He was too sympathetic. And we can know that based on what Irenaeus wrote in his letter in AD 190 to Pope Victor, when he identified the popes during the 2nd century who were tolerant, who were sympathetic of the 14 Nisan churches. He named a succession of them. He named Xystus and Telesphorus and Pius and Anicetus, 2 and 2, but right in between them was this bishop Hyginus, who followed Telesphorus. And so the bishop, and we know Telesphorus was martyred. Irenaeus wrote about that. And we know Irenaeus would not identify Hyginus as one of the tolerant bishops. And so we can surmise from that, I think reliably, very plausibly, that the cause of the martyrdom of Telesphorus at Rome in AD 138 was over this Paschal controversy, of which Hyginus was hostile toward. Then in AD 156, you have the martyrdom of Polycarp at Smyrna, who I just talked about. Polycarp at Smyrna had the audacity, if you will, to go to Rome in about AD 155, just right in advance of that, to go to Rome and argue on behalf of the 14 Nisan churches. A very presumptuous thing to do. And it's no coincidence that right on the heels of that, he gets back to his home at Smyrna and he's burned alive at the stake. Are you seeing the common factor in all of these? Rome, 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 right? Ignatius is taken to Rome to be put before the wild animals. Telesphorus is the bishop of Rome, is martyred ostensibly by Hyginus, and because of his being too sympathetic toward the 14 Nisan churches. And Hyginus, identified specifically by Irenaeus as being unsympathetic, intolerant toward the 14 Nisan churches. Polycarp, AD 156, after his trip to Rome, is put to death almost immediately on the heels of that trip at Smyrna, being publicly burned alive at the stake. Later, about a decade later, in the mid-160s, you have Justin, who became known as Justin Martyr, one of the great apologists of the early church. He had a theological school at Rome, and his theological school was massacred. We have record of about 6, including Justin and 5 others of his school that he operated there at Rome, his theological school, were beheaded, AD 156, or excuse me, AD 166. Then AD 177, the churches in Gaul, at Lyon and Vienna, those 2 major cities in southern Gaul. One of them Irenaeus would become the bishop of. The churches in Gaul had a massacre of their leadership. They were a 14 Nisan community transplanted there from Asia. A major massacre. We have a full letter describing the atrocities that were perpetrated against the church there. Concurrently with that, Irenaeus was dispatched to Rome to plead on their behalf. And who did Irenaeus plead to in Rome? Not the emperor. He went to the Pope at Rome, who at that time was Eleutherus. He pleaded on behalf of the churches in his home, Gaul, not to the emperor, but to the Roman Pope. He went to the Roman Pope and pleaded mercy on behalf of the churches in Lyon. This is the history through the 2nd century that's leading up to this controversy where Pope Victor takes a unilateral action of excommunicating all the churches in Asia in AD 190. This is the history of the early church. Church that is not well known, has not been well understood, is not talked about, and it's a tragedy. If you don't know your history, you don't know how to interpret your theology. History, and I'll say this, Robert and I were talking about it earlier today. The writers in the early church, the apologists, like, for instance, Justin Martyr, one of the great apologists of the early church. He wrote Apology 1, Apology 2, and what we know as the dialogue with Trypho, an apologetic work to the Jews who were still opposing the Christian church. One of the great apologists of the early church, and that just means they're writing to defend the church. And Irenaeus, one of the great apologists of the early church, their writings were steeped in history, church. When you're defending the faith of the church, you don't just, they didn't just say, well, you know, we just believe in Jesus and we're going to let God lead this and we don't really care about all that academic stuff. They didn't do that at all. The apologists in the early church, the church that was being persecuted and their leaders were being martyred, people were being killed for the faith. They did not ignore history. They did not ignore secular academia. They engaged with the secular philosophy. They engaged with the history that as they knew it, the historical events. They engaged with all of that. That's how they defended the faith. They did it through the lens of good, accurate perception, knowledge, observation, analyzing history. And they did it through the lens of how people were thinking. How did they think? Why do they think the way they think? And much of the way the people that they were engaging with their apologetic works, much of their thinking was steeped in Greco-Roman philosophy, and not least Platonism. And they were engaging in all. They didn't ignore it. They learned it, and they engaged it. And that's what we have to do, church. We have to, it's so critical, it's so vital. If you're going to have an accurate understanding of Christianity and Christian faith, what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to practice our Christian faith? What were the Nisan 14 churches of Asia, exactly what were they clinging to? It wasn't just a day, was it? They weren't going to their deaths, holding to and clinging to the tradition of the apostles just for the sake of the date of 14 Nisan, was it? No. 14 Nisan was being eradicated because it was a sign that represented their faith practice. If you wanted to, we're seeing that today in our own country. If you want to eliminate a culture, you have to eliminate their signs and their symbols. And 14 Nisan was the annual holy day, a sign and a symbol of this entire manner of observing the Christian faith, of worshiping God, if you will. And so if you're going to eliminate, if you're going to cancel that faith tradition, one of the things you have to do is eliminate their signs and their symbols. The primary one of which was Nisan 14 as the annual holy day. No, you're not going to have Nisan 14. You're going to hold to the Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox, like we do in Rome. That's going to be your sign. That's going to be your symbol. So they were swapping, or trying to force them to swap symbols. The other thing you do, if you want to eliminate a culture, is you have to eliminate their leaders. And that we see, as I just enumerated, was done all throughout the 2nd century. Periodically, systematically, the leadership that would exert themselves, like Ignatius, like Telesphorus, like Polycarp, like Justin, and like Pothinus was the bishop from Asia of the church at Lyon that was massacred in AD 177. You have to eliminate their leaders. That's been known throughout the history of humanity, that if you want to defeat a foreign culture, you're going to have to take out their leaders. You got to take out their symbols. You got to take out their leaders. That's what you see happening throughout the 2nd century. And the edict of Victor in AD 190 to excommunicate the churches at Asia was nothing less than his coercive effort to eliminate the sign, the symbol of the day Nisan 14 as the annual holy day that was observed by the churches that cling to, that hold to this ancient apostolic manner of practice in the Christian faith, the obedience from faith. That's the history. I think I'm going to close by reading one page that I actually captured I call it summarizing thoughts. See, at the end of a long 60-page report, and I just want to read this to you, where I summarize my thoughts about this Paschal controversy that spanned the 2nd century. It was over these competition between these two competing Christian traditions, one being the Apostolic, Pauline, Johannine, ancient tradition of the apostles that Paul called the Evangelion of Christ, and the other being this Judaized Christianity that began at Jerusalem and was fostered and fueled and championed ultimately by the church at Rome. Paul called the other Evangelion, what certain men from Judea came teaching, that unless you keep the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And you see this in Catholic Orthodoxy is still steeped in the law of Moses. They have not, and ostensibly now the moral law of Moses, not temple sacrifices and the annual feasts and things of that nature, but the moral law of Moses is still the fundamental undergirding principle of Catholic Orthodoxy. And so you see this competition, violent engagement on the part of Catholic Orthodoxy against the 14 Nisan churches throughout the 2nd century. You see it emerge with the writings of John at the end of the 1st century. And you see it playing out with the killing of the leaders of the 14 Nisan churches throughout the 2nd century. And ultimately, at the end of the 2nd century, they decide it's time to take out their symbol. This is called cancel culture. The Catholic Orthodox tradition out of Rome is basically doing what has always been known throughout history is necessary to eradicate a culture that you don't want around. You take out their leaders, you take out their symbols. That's what's happening in the 2nd century. So let me read. The so-called Paschal controversy was nothing less than an extended surreptitious campaign by the proto-Orthodox presbytery at Rome, often with the full support of the episcopal office at Rome, and always perpetrated through the secular power of the Roman Empire to destroy the ancient tradition of the apostles. Their strategy was two-pronged. On the one hand, there were the scattered acts of terrorism wherefore the leaders of this 14 Nisan tradition were very publicly and gruesomely humiliated and put to death, just as was Jesus Christ himself. History proves the best way to suppress a movement is to eliminate its leaders. On the other hand, the primary symbol of the 14 Nisan tradition was outlawed. That is, the annual 14 Nisan Paschal observance itself. As history continues to prove, the most effective way to cancel any culture is to destroy its signs and its symbols. And so, most important for the sake of making historical reflection relevant today, it is necessary to understand the ancient Paschal controversy as not simply what day of the year to observe the historical death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, but rather as the systematic cancellation of the ancient tradition of the apostles. Wherefore the 14 Nisan fast, that is what Polycrates called the denial of the leaven. He's talking about the dying to self according to the obedience from faith into spiritually spoken worship. That is the denial of the leaven, as Polycrates called it, one of their vernacular terms, which was so offensive, which is what Irenaeus mentioned in his letter, is that their fast practice, the denial of the leaven, was offensive to those who don't keep that same fast practice. What he called the great ones, the others. This is Irenaeus referring to that other tradition. He calls them the great ones because Rome had primacy among all the churches in the Roman Empire. And so Irenaeus acknowledged that in his letter by calling them the great ones, the others being the other ones of two. It's a duality. That is the ecclesial leadership at Rome. That they the 14 Nisan tradition might once and for all not only replaced with what Irenaeus called the latter derived ecclesial tradition. He calls that in his own writings, this tradition at Rome, the latter derived ecclesial tradition, which would early on self-identify as Catholic Orthodoxy. They called themselves Catholic Orthodoxy not because they were correct, but because that's what they wanted to be known as. They called themselves Catholic Orthodoxy. So not only to replace the tradition, but also to be eliminated entirely, even its memory through the subsequent Catholic Orthodox campaign of damnatio memoriae. And that just means that you just damn the very memory, their writings, the history of them. You change everything so that even the very memory of the 14 Nisan tradition is damned, which began with the 2nd century decree of the Roman emperor that outlawed 14 Nisan literature in Asia, and then found its crescendo several centuries later in AD 381. By this time, Catholic Orthodoxy is well seated under the secular arm of a Christian Roman emperor, Constantinople, when the state-sponsored institution of Catholic Orthodoxy acted carte blanche to drive the final death nail into the coffin by formally anathematizing the 14 Nisan faith tradition. Meaning in 381, the Catholic Orthodox institution called a universal council of Catholic Orthodox bishops to Constantinople, which is where the Roman emperor was seated. And one of the things they did in AD 381 at that council was essentially to outlaw the 14 Nisan churches, that tradition of that ancient apostolic tradition, to outlaw it as formal heresy. AD 381, that's the final death nail. These are the historical facts as preserved in the primary sources. So we're about an hour into it here, and I've raced through history. There's a lot more that can be said, but my purpose here today is to give you that historical perspective of what happened in the early church. Why do we perceive and view and practice Christianity today the way we do? What happened to the earliest Christianity that you read about in the New Testament scriptures? For instance, read chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, I pray in tongues more than all of you, and I would that all of you would pray in tongues, Paul wrote. And so you have to ask through the lens of the fact that for most of church history, there's been no praying in tongues, at least not in the visible church of which we have writings. And so you have to ask, well, what happened then? What happened to that ancient tradition of the apostles, where praying in tongues was so important, so vital, so central to practicing the Christian faith? What happened to it? And this is the story, the Paschal controversy that John the Fourth Evangelist wrote about, was confronting, that played out throughout the 2nd century with the leaders of these 14 Nisan churches being publicly tortured, humiliated, and then killed. At the end of the 2nd century, with the 14 Nisan churches being excommunicated from fellowship, to the end of the 4th century, AD 381, where it was finally just completely outlawed by the Catholic Orthodox Church. That's the history. So it's not flattering. I know it's not flattering, but it's important to know your history if you're going to understand the Christian faith and understand how to interpret the New Testament scriptures. It's important, it's vital, and I will say it's essential that you understand the early history of the church. What happened in those early centuries of the early church. And that's the story. So God bless you, church. I wish I had a happier story to convey to you here today, and I will in coming weeks as we exegete the Gospel of John. Fascinating way that with a lot of typology that the fourth evangelist lays out the gospel for us. And we're going to be talking about that a lot in the coming months. So God bless you. We'll see you next Sunday at 10:30. And God willing, we'll be back with Sarah this week for another discussion on that she wants to talk about on the faith. And we'll see you then.